I'm just going to say a little bit at the start and then hand over to Kate, and then I'll pick up again at the end. It's October 2017. October 2011, we did our main consultation on the Edinburgh Local Development Plan. We published the main issues report. The second most important, we grouped it into 6 issues. The second most important was infrastructure provision. The first, obviously, being housing growth. We knew that we shouldn't just do the usual thing, which is produce a plan that goes through the topics and then at the end have a chapter called delivery or infrastructure, which basically just said, all of this development will need some kind of infrastructure. We're not sure who's going to pay for it, probably developers, and we'll just leave it to the development management process. We knew that we knew this was a main issue for this particular local development plan. The reason we knew that was at the time there were a set of drivers for change. Some of those were particular to that time, back in 2011, early 2012. Some of those are basically facts of life that I think will be the case even in a new planning system, even with different elements in the statutory context. But back at that stage, we had a set of contribution policies which were across different guidelines, prepared at different times. Collectively, they were inefficient. Sometimes they were asking for too much money, because it was basically a sort of simple formulaic approach that didn't have regard to whether there was an infrastructure need or not. It just said, here's a formula. Sometimes it was asking for too little. What would come in wasn't actually useful to be able to deliver a project, and might have to get paid back in the fullness of time. And really fundamentally, that kind of old-style contributions policy approach we had couldn't cope with a situation where two or more separate sites gave rise to a single action, a major bit of transport infrastructure or a new school. It couldn't deal with cumulative impact. Now, at the time, in the main issues report, we reflected on the long-term changed role of the public sector, so contrasting with the situation in, for example, the 80s and 90s, that budgets weren't growth-oriented, and you've heard a lot about that already today, and there was complexity of providers in terms of who provide infrastructure, including utilities, but also transport as well. And obviously, in 2011, that winter, we had the double-dip recession, if you recall, and that was feeding its way through in terms of doing viability tests and basically working down contributions from your previous historical Section 75s in order to get development going again. And we also realised, and it may sound like a sort of obvious thing, but developer interests are not always the same thing as landowner interests. Developers, if they've got enough notice, they can work through even quite large-scale contributions back onto the land value, depending on what deal they've done and the timings. Whereas landowners are always pretty much looking to realise the hope value for their greenfield release or their aspirational greenfield release. I think that will always be the case. But you have to recognise that developers and landowners aren't the same, and your policies need to accommodate that. Also, this sheer scale of growth, where it grew during the course of the LDP project due to changes at strategic development plan level, but the sheer scale of the growth was such that it sort of throws everything into sharp relief. We're dealing with thousands upon thousands of homes worth of land, and also even with trying to direct growth to the appropriate locations where there was infrastructure capacity, making best use of existing infrastructure, we were going to need significant enhancements. I think it's fair to say at the time, as an organisation, there was a notion that all that growth is developers' growth, not ours. So that was certainly the case out with the planning, and I think within planning as well to a certain point. And therefore, if the growth happened or not really didn't matter. In fact, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't matter if the infrastructure is not provided because you don't need it. But we took ownership of the growth, partly because we knew that it was going to happen through appeal anyway, and that was the context. So we set out some of that in the question in the main issues report. I've got to say we didn't have a solution at that time, and I've also got to say we didn't get a particularly conclusive response from all the respondents at the main issues report stage. So as we proceeded into 2012 towards 2013, and we were preparing the plan itself and our first action programme, and also coincidentally when Kate Hopper joined the project team, and I asked her to prepare an action programme for this, we developed a new approach. And over the subsequent 5 or so years, we came up with what Kate's about to tell you about.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, so what is Edinburgh's action programme? David Leslie, as the head of planning, described it as 3 things: couple of weeks ago. It's corporate, it's cumulative, and it's credible. And those are the key three things I want to talk you through. But as an action programme, it's our plan-led strategy to support the growth in Edinburgh. It sets out actions. We all know what an action programme is meant to do, but ours also does costings and timings. I'll go into a bit more detail about why. As Ben said, it's all about cumulative impacts, and ours links to the supplementary guidance on developer contributions, and we are updating ours annually, so some key introduction points about our action programme. So corporate, there was a question about why and how. How did we manage to make Edinburgh's action programme so corporate? And these are what our corporate leadership team recognised in why we do action programming. The council and the public sector needs to support the growth and sometimes deliver it, and that has a huge bill attached to it. You may have seen some figures for Edinburgh in the realms of £400 million of delivering the infrastructure to go with the LDP. Developers aren't going to pay for all of that. There's a big funding gap, so we need significant public investment in that. How do we find the money? What do we prioritise to get that money? And that requires clear governance to deliver those projects and that growth. We have an oversight group chaired by the Chief Executive and an Action Programme Board, and I'll show you the structure in a second. But what they do is they ensure that decisions on our budgets, expenditure and projects are properly informed as they go through the process. And importantly for us, identify the corporate and financial risks to the public sector in doing this. So what does it look like? This is the structure of our oversight group and board. Say Chief Exec right at the very top. Paul, Executive Director of Place, sits on that. They meet quarterly. We've never not had a meeting without the Chief Exec chairing that, and that's been 8 meetings of that group. At the project board level, it's chaired by the Chief Planning Officer, and it has those services responsible for delivering the actions on it. So that's the assets, the transport, communities and families, the schools, the health partnership, and parks and green space. But sits below that, and there's a big team below that that runs this project. Ben and myself, we have a support officer that runs everything for us and a lifesaver, finance, economic development, corporate property, and also our DM reps feed into that project. So it's not just the structure of the board and the oversight group, it's all us working on it behind that. So the second point, cumulative. Why cumulative? We need to understand the true requirements of delivering city-wide growth. And that's all those things that fall under an action programme, from the tram to strategic transport, from public realm, green space and primary healthcare as well. What's the true cost of all those things? And somebody mentioned True this morning about what's the full inflated cost by the time we've built all these things, is what we need to build into the process as well. It also allows for a funding mechanism to be established, and we talked about a levy this morning, and I think in terms of what Edinburgh's doing, it's very similar to the proposed levy in terms of a cumulative strategy-based approach. Credible, what's your business plan? Why are we doing this? Infrastructure is always linked to the impact of development. So it's transparent, the action programme is in the public domain, it's accurate and justified, we've appraised the impact through transport appraisals, healthcare appraisals, education appraisals, and we've costed each of the projects within the action programme. Not saying that's been easy, that's taken years to get to a point where we've now got a costed action programme, and some things are still being costed as we go along the process. And these actions need to be deliverable, so they need to be site-specific. We need to know what we're spending and when. But it also needs to be dynamic in that we have new applications coming forward, we have big sites that come on the table. We've not got fixed actions. So that's why I update it annually, so we can actually change the process when it was required. And we do a financial impact and delivery report annually, and the next one will be in January of next year. Just as a bit of a case study, this is looking at education. We talked a lot about delivering new schools. Edinburgh assessed the impact of growth on our education catchment areas. These aren't specifically school catchment areas, but amalgamated catchment areas looking at high schools in particular as primary feeds into those. So we have 12 of those catchment areas. Is there an impact? yes, there's a huge impact, and this is not even the full list of all of the education requirements for Edinburgh, including 8 new primary schools and 20 or 30 extensions to primary schools, over £200 million worth of education infrastructure. They've all been costed and programmed of when they are required based on those areas. But education is not the only thing. This is a map of North East Edinburgh locality, and it's actually been work that we've been doing to speak to our localities team about what the impact of growth is. So you've got the amount of housing land identified within that area. For North Edinburgh, it's 12,844 houses proposed to go into North Edinburgh. Where the impact on the surgeries is, where's the new schools going to go, where's the big new transport links, that's tram going down Leaf Walk. Where the big new park is in South East Edinburgh down here, South East Greater Parkland, and as I said, where the new primary schools are. So we can start talking about where the growth is and what the impact is on how you create a community with all those services as part of it. I just want to talk about some of the risks and challenges and how the process is trying to solve some of those. Funding through developer contributions. I don't think there's any developers in the room, but the misuse of contributions through the 5 tests has been a big issue for us in terms of actually having appeals, unilateral obligations, Section 75A and B, in terms of not actually receiving the funding that we've identified as being required to deliver their net impact. Each time through an appeal process that we don't receive it, we're creating an additional funding gap. So the misuse or the use of the appeal system to get that, you all know that's a big issue. And as a fact of life, development viability, hope value of land, we have a lot of viability testing going on of our sites. So a lot of sites come through without contributions on them because of viability. What we've been trying to do is actually have the action programme and the supplementary guidance as that infrastructure strategy, that business case to why we need that money. What we've been talking about with the business case for the levy this morning is using the action programme as a delivery programme and supplementary guidance as a business case as why. It's not always working, and to be honest about that, it's not 100% working, and I'm interested to find out how the levy would work in the same way with some of those issues that we've got within there. The programme of delivering infrastructure is dependent on the programme for delivering housing. Ben said, do you need the infrastructure if you're not building the housing? The two things are intrinsically linked. If we fund infrastructure, would that result in a deficit to the council if the housing doesn't actually happen? Whether that's a total deficit or an annual deficit based on a funding strategy of that. So we need to make sure that development is delivered in line with the speed of housing. So we've been linking our housing land and delivery programme to our action programme. The two things are now completely linked. So we can understand the delivery programme on an annual basis. We can set the capital spend based on that delivery programme, as well as addressing constraints on land and supporting higher delivery rates, the key part of growth for Edinburgh. And that's what it looks like. This is our annual cycle. So we're here at the moment, exactly what we're doing right now, ready for a January publication of the 2018 action programme. What's needed, when's it needing, updating the strategy, updating the timetable, updating the costs to this year's costs. And at the same time, because the budget reporting is going on right now, we're feeding that into the budget. If we did that in January, it's too late. We need to know now what we're actually doing. So everything actually on here is 2 months ahead in terms of reporting. But that's our annual programme of the document. Now, Sat's going to talk a bit more about this. So Sat's over there now. Hi, Sat. About why we're doing growth-oriented financial planning. And these are the kind of key things from my point of view, and Sat's going to tell you from his point of view what planners need to do. But from a planner's point of view to a finance colleague, we need to understand the total capital spend of an action programme and what that means on an overall annual and long-term exposure to the public sector. So that's not just talking councils, that's to NHS Lothian as well. I need to understand what other capital investment we're talking about. Paul talked about Piccadilly Place. He talked about a citywide public realm strategy. Those two things are could be council priorities that are going to compete for the money that we're looking for to deliver the new schools programme or a new road junction. And I also need to understand the revenue cost on council services. So how much are these new assets going to cost to run? What's the cost of the new teachers? What's the life cycle costs of running that new school? What's the waste? What's the lighting? And just an example in terms of what we've been working on in terms of modelling of these kind of costs. You won't have to probably read this, but you can go back and have a look at the presentation. These are all the inputs from a planning point of view that we've given to our financial colleagues to model the annual and overall cost of the action programme. Everything from the construction timetable to the debt servicing to construction costs to contingency to inflation. There's lots and lots of things that we've built into the model. And I just want to show you in terms of why. So, an example of all the new primary schools that need to be built in Edinburgh, and the two yellow ones that I've highlighted here are two schools in the South East. I've highlighted these because they're furthest ahead at the moment. These are all the sites at the bottom which are going to be funding those new schools. And this is when we're going to be receiving the money based on existing Section 75 agreements or programming of that. As you can see, we're not actually receiving most of the money until after the school is required to be built. So we need to be able to programme, from our point of view, how and when and why, where's the money coming from to be able to fund those two new schools in Edinburgh. So we provide those inputs to our finance colleagues to tell them what's the answer to this, how do we fund those schools. And the other flip side of it, that's the capital side, the flip side of it is the revenue side. So this is an example of a housing site down in southeast Edinburgh, Fairmile Head, 277 dwellings. How much does it cost the council to light that on an annual basis per house? And do we need to build that into our financial model? Yes, we need to build that into the financial model. Just one example of a suburban type housing development. Costs £7.88 a dwelling to light that. And over £1,000 per kilometre for carriageway lighting. So that kind of analysis starts building in a future, what's the new parts of Edinburgh going to do? And we're building 25,000 houses. So that's just one housing site in Edinburgh. I think that's my last slide. I'm going to hand back over to Ben in terms of a bit higher level.
So where we are now is quite a different place to where we were 6 years ago. The council, following the elections back in spring, the administration is formed. It reported and published its business plan back in August. There's a the diagram in the bottom right corner there. I don't know if you can make it out, but that's showing the sort of strategic framework in which the council business plan is operating. The top bit talks about long-term planning and the 2050 Edinburgh City Vision, which was a sort of engagement process that was carried out last autumn, winter, I think, with the citizenry of the city of all ages to talk about what kind of city we want, because it was felt that was lacking previously. So that's the top level. But that middle blue bar, which talks about partnership, multi-agency things, city-region deals mentioned. But that middle line says community plan and LDP. The phrase community plan in Edinburgh is the locality outcome improvement plan in some other parts of Scotland. It's the high level document that covers the whole authority area. We've got one that's just coming to the end of its period and a new one's beginning. But next to it is LDP. And then below that talk about locality improvement plans, and then the red bar at the bottom talks about internal. So corporate strategies, the council business plan, the council strategies, director business plan. So the LDP in the sort of diagram here is higher than that. I'm not aware, I think that came from elected members, to be honest. I certainly, as LDP project manager, wasn't manoeuvring to have that kind of prominence there. But I think it reflects the understanding of our councillors, having gone through the first LDP process, that the LDP needs to be something which aligns with the community plan. I'll show you a diagram in a minute about how we think about that. So we've got a certain amount of recognition and understanding of the importance of the development plan in the sort of wider corporate planning framework. We've got 4 locality improvement plans. Again, that's the Edinburgh term, I think, from. I can't actually remember what the term used elsewhere, but these are the... Right, okay. These are the sub-area for North East. That diagram, the map that Kate showed you of North East, was actually prepared initially for us to share with locality teams and other groups that were thinking in locality terms to help them see what breakdown of what the LDP and the action programme means for their area. So we're working on coordination of that, and I think that will develop over the coming years. Some of the stuff that Kate was showing you has been the part of reports to the Finance and Resource Committee on the financial implications of the action programme as it's understood. And that's a regular cycle now, so it's another committee we're reporting to. It's another set of reports we do in parallel. I think that will carry on, and so it should. Which is all great, but I wouldn't want you to go away with the impression that we've got a sort of finished solution at Edinburgh. It's not as though the next budget for the council is confirmed and is going to cover the gap from all the stuff that's coming through the action programme. That's not the case, and I'm not necessarily that will be the case in future. We've put up there that there's an issue that the central government block grant isn't necessarily aligned with this funding gap that's arising. And there's a final point there that quite often people talk about innovative funding mechanisms. They were talking about it in 2011 when we consulted on our MIR. It's a phrase that people like to come up with whenever we talk about this problem. But there's risk of that, being seen as a panacea or a silver bullet, but under-delivering. The state-region deal is providing money for infrastructure in Edinburgh, but it's not covering social infrastructure like the school estate, which is one of the big chunks of it. And the actual transport items it's paying for are just 2 parts of a much bigger range. So there's still a lot of work to do, and we wouldn't want you to think we've got good practice. We're just we're doing some stuff in Edinburgh that is perhaps of interest. Just before I wrap up, we're going to take you through something we've developed over the last year or two, which is our way of thinking about the relationship between what development plan teams do and community planning. So the context, and the point was made earlier by I think Alistair, that you deliver services from infrastructure like nurseries or spaces, but it's in the context of service delivery. We've got our locality outcome improvement plan, or Edinburgh's community plan, which sets the strategy for service delivery in the city. That's the outcome over there in the right-hand box. We've got the local development plan, which should be the spatial expression of that community plan. We've got the action programme, which sets out the actions required to deliver the LDP and potentially the spatial aspects of the community plan up here. And in that, there's an issue. I don't have a laser in either. There's an issue. Partners have asset strategies, and that potentially the various community planning partners have got physical assets. They've got estates, some of them, which they could use to help achieve some of the outcomes set out in the community plan. And so, the overall outcome of if we achieve this, the overall outcome could be joined up service delivery and infrastructure investment, and also the full costs of growth being estimated and planned for. I'm not saying that's where we're at now, but that's where we're heading as a council with our partners. And this shows a bit about partnership prepares a community plan. It's delivered through a locality basis. LDP prepared by the council, delivered by primarily the Planning and Building Standards Service, primarily through its development management statutory duties. The action programme prepared by the council, delivered through, don't press that button on the top of this. The action programme delivered through action programme governance, which is what Kate's telling you about. It's all the different bits of the council and people like the Health and Social Care Partnership. And if we can get this working into a virtuous cycle, what that means is that we'll have working arrangements which provide feedback and intelligence for future plans. And that's how I think we can move towards greater alignment of community planning, local development plan, using the action programme. The action programme is critical to this. And what we've set out here is we've prepared this especially for today. Are my thoughts, my sort of planners' understanding of the wider policy and programme landscape at both national and local level. I've used colours that are a bit faint on the screen, but if you think, we've got Scottish planning policy, it's a document, it's published at I've done it again. Put that down. We've got Scottish planning policy, prepared at national level, sets out clear context for our development plans. Maybe you've got a strategic development plan in between, but let's not worry about that just now. And councils prepare LDPs. We've got a national housing strategy, Homes for Fit for the 21st Century, and councils prepare their housing strategy as well. And both of those are unambiguously growth-oriented structures at national level and at local level. Transport, we've got national transport strategy, and councils prepare local transport strategy, and of course you've got RTSs as well, regional ones. There's the Scotland Schools for the Future programme at national level, and Edinburgh's got something called the Schools and Lifelong Learning in the State Strategic Review, which is sort of how it's been implemented at local level. These are all documents, by the way. In terms of finance, and it could be my ignorance, but I'm not aware of the sort of the financial version of SPP as a document you can go to and read that says, you know, this is what you have to do in terms of supporting growth. And of course we do have budgets and a long-term financial plan at council level. But I suppose my point about this is the bits at the top and the bottom. All along the bottom, we are trying to use our action programme to be a common document that speaks to these 5 documents that is prepared at local level, and it's growth-oriented across the whole board. It's taken us several years to get to that point. We've still got all the costs to add up, but the relationships, the conversations, the language we're using, it's all growth-oriented. And I think at national level, I'm not sure that the context that's been set out in terms of transport strategy and education strategy is quite so unambiguously growth-oriented. I don't know. This is just setting this out here, something I've not seen before, and thinking about the relationship between the different systems that we operate at national and local level. So, to summarise, before we hand over to our colleague Sat Patel from Finance, it takes time to reform policy. We're talking, I can hardly believe it, we're talking about something we started 6 years ago. As hopefully it's clear from what Kate has said, it's the government, and certainly what Paul was saying, the governance and processes are important in statutory documents. In terms of how much time you spend as the lead officer of the action programme, how much of it is on producing the document as opposed to the...
About 1%.
Well, that's possibly an exaggeration, but it's about the process, it's about that action programme board, the oversight group, the dialogue, the meetings. I think the collaboration across services on the financial programme has been critical. And as you'll have gathered, I think, from what Paul was saying, the leadership and the culture has been a key ingredient that it sounds like is not universal across the country, and not necessarily universal inside Edinburgh Council as well, but we're in a different place to where we were. And that's allowed us to have this corporate, cumulative, and credible approach. And just finally, I think this is sort of fits quite well with what we heard this morning as well, and this is just my personal view. We need growth-oriented financial planning across local and central government if we're to be realising the outcomes that we say we want.